Hello, also, this is a video on key questions on macroeconomic policy. So, anyone who's preparing this topic should know these questions really well. They're all recent questions and they're all really important questions. They focus on fiscal and monetary policy and supply side policy, and they also look at how to control inflation and also how to control balance of payment deficit. So, let's start with it. The first question that I'm going to discuss is one which is November 16 variant 2, and I'm not going to do the first part. I'm just going to focus on the second part, which is a policy question, which says this: that discuss the policy options available to a government faced with inflation and consider which is most likely to be effective. The way I'm going to go start with this question is I'm going to look at first what kind of inflations are out there. So there is demand pull inflation, there is cost push inflation, and then there is monetary inflation. Now, for demand pull inflation, we will use what we call demand side policies, which entails contractionary fiscal and contractionary monetary policy. So, contractionary fiscal policy has basically two tools. The first tool that contractionary fiscal policy has is to reduce government expenditure. And since aggregate demand is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M, so when G goes down, AD goes down. And similarly, when AD goes down, automatically this would result in the price level to go down. The second tool the contractionary fiscal policy entails is basically the tool of taxation. So we increase taxation in the case of contractionary fiscal policy. We do that in order to reduce aggregate demand as disposable income falls. So a fall of disposable income results in not only consumption to fall, but also firms would be shying away from investment, so investment would fall, which in turn causes AD to fall and therefore the price level to fall. So fiscal policy uses government expenditure and taxation in order to reduce the aggregate demand in an economy, which in turn can reduce the price level. On the other hand, monetary policy uses what we call money supply, which effectively change the interest rate. So when the government decides to reduce money supply, that results in interest rates to go up. A rise in interest rate would do two things. Number one, cost of borrowing will go up. Second is that incentive to save will also go up, causing consumption to fall as consumers find it expensive to borrow money, and also the opportunity cost of saving is going up, and also investment to fall as firms also find it expensive to borrow money to invest, ultimately making the AD fall and therefore the price level to fall. And we'll make another diagram when we're discussing our first contractionary fiscal and monetary policy, which are called demand side policies. I write price level on my y-axis, I write real GDP on my x-axis, and in my answer I'm going to show AD curve shifting backwards. So first we'll start off by saying that currently the equilibrium is at P naught with GDP level at Y naught. A fall of AD will result in the price level to fall and real GDP to also decline. But what's more important is that we are able to control inflation in this case, mainly demand pull inflation. Now we discuss the cost push inflation. So for cost push inflation, we use supply side policies. Supply side policies are government attempts to increase productivity of an economy and shift the aggregate supply to the right. In the long run, such policies basically are designed to improve the long run capacity of the economy. It also helps in increasing international competitiveness. And if you go back to the causes of cost push inflation, These policies are trying to sort of address problems like, for example, if there is a tax push inflation, so you lower taxes. If there is a wage push inflation, so you lower the power of trade unions. If there is a profit push inflation, so you reduce the power of monopoly. And if there is imported inflation, then we find basically either cheaper domestic substitutes or even give subsidies wherever possible in order to lower the cost of production. Also, alongside supply side policies may entail something like using research and development and also improving infrastructure in order to increase the aggregate supply of the economy. In terms of the diagram, this is how it will look like. So, assuming currently the equilibrium is at P naught, where AD naught and AS naught are aggregate supply and demand curve, and let's say the government wants to reduce the price level through supply side policies, ultimately the effect of that would be the aggregate supply curve will be shifted to the right. A rightward shift of the aggregate supply curve would mean a rise in productive capacity of the economy, lowering the cost of production. So we have a lower price level and a higher GDP. An important thing to see in this diagram is just that supply side policies are basically helping us achieve our macroeconomic goals. In fact, all of the macroeconomic goals. So look at this. First of all, there is a lower price level. So there is, of course, low inflation that is happening, or lower inflation through supply side policies. Another important aspect is that not only inflation is going down, but the GDP is also going up. So there is higher sort of economic growth. There is economic growth taking place. And thirdly, more importantly, because of output going up, unemployment is going down. And lastly, the fact that price level is going down, a country would be able to get comparative advantage, gain comparative advantage. So one would believe that there would be X minus M improvement happening through supply side policies. That's why for us, supply side policies are very desirable because they do not have any macroeconomic sort of conflict in terms of goals. The only downside to supply side policies is that they are expensive to undertake because you're spending a lot of money in education and training and subsidies and infrastructure development and R&D. So they're really expensive to undertake. And second, they're not only expensive, but they take a lot longer to implement. In other words, there are time lags attached to these supply side policies. And because we're spending so much money, there is always an opportunity cost. More expenditure in one thing would mean less expenditure elsewhere. So these are the three downsides of supply side policies. But the fact that they do not have any macroeconomic trade-offs, they are very desirable. I want to go back to quickly to look at this diagram when we were doing demand side policies. Look at demand side policies downside. What are the biggest downside of demand side policies is this: there is a conflict in terms of policy goals. While we are able to lower inflation and basically also dampen expenditure, there is a downside that it also results in unemployment to rise and GDP of the economy to fall, which would mean that demand side policies are not helping us achieve all the goals of macroeconomics. Now, for monetary inflation, we know that monetary inflation happens because of a rise in money supply. Because when the money supply goes up, it could be possible that money supply could be more than money demand, and that excess liquidity or rise in liquidity result in people to spend more money, and that larger expenditure would make the AD rise and therefore the price level to rise. So in this case, clearly a contractionary monetary policy could be a way to go forward. Now let's look at the evaluation bit here. what they're saying in this question is this, that which is most likely to be effective. So here we can write about a couple of things. First, we can say that if you want to fix demand side inflation, clearly do demand side policies. But if you want to solve cost push inflation, do supply side policies. Supply side policies, we can also say, are useful for both demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. So supply side policies have a far reaching impact when it comes to inflation. However, supply side policies are expensive, and they take much longer to implement, and most importantly, they have an opportunity cost. So if an economy wants to sort of have a long-term plan towards fixing inflation, probably supply side policies are a way to go forward. Demand side policies are quick and effective, but they cause unemployment, and they also cause GDP of the economy to fall. So if you already are suffering from cost push inflation, doing demand side policy could be extremely dangerous for an economy, because it could further increase a recession in an economy. Moving on to the next question, the one we will do now is this one, which says is that discuss how the policy chosen to reduce the rate of inflation will be influenced by the cause of the inflation, and consider which type of inflation is most difficult to reduce and why. So the first part is easy. We'll talk about how when you have demand pull inflation, we can use demand side policies, right? And when we have cost push inflation, we can use supply side policies. Hey, we'll talk about both contractionary fiscal and monetary policy when we talk about demand side policies. We'll make the diagram that we did draw in the earlier question, and then we talk about how for cost push inflation, various supply side policies are used. Now the next part here says is that consider which type of inflation is most difficult to reduce and why. And as far as I'm concerned, I think cost push inflation will be difficult to reduce, primarily because the kind of policies we use to control cost push inflation may take much longer to show its results, which means may take longer to implement, and also they're costly. So one could argue this maybe supply side policies may be challenging. However, having said that, one could also write this something about demand side policies, that when you look at demand side policies, because they're contractionary in nature, sometimes they are deeply unpopular among the voters. These policies try to reduce demand by curbing people's ability to buy, which could make them unpopular. So you can write any evaluation. You can also talk about the downsides of demand side policies as another evaluation point in this answer. So let's do March 16 variant 2. It says is that compared to policies that may be considered to solve the problem of demand pull inflation, and evaluate which is likely to be more effective. So we can in this question again talk about that when you look at demand pull inflation, we can use both demand side policies, and we can also use supply side policies to solve the problem of demand pull inflation. We can then talk about the various tools of demand side policies, like contractually fiscal and monetary policy, and then different tools of supply side policies, like for example, education and training, trade union powers to be reduced, monopoly power to be reduced, and so on. And then what we can do is talk about which is more likely to be effective. So when it comes to effectiveness, we can talk about how it all depends on short run versus long run. In the short run, probably demand side policies are more effective. They work quickly, but they have conflict in terms of policy goals. On the other hand, supply side policies again can work in the long run, costly but effective, and do not have a trade-off, and can help achieve all the four macroeconomic goals. So you can write a good answer for this one. Moving on, let's look at this one. Discuss the advantages and disadvantages of supply side policies, which we've done earlier, and consider whether its effectiveness in an economy that is facing a labor shortage. So if you are facing a labor shortage, then I think supply side policies are the way to go forward, because they are the ones which are looking at increasing productive potential of an economy. So if they are trying to increase the productive potential of an economy, then they are probably the right sort of policies in terms of labor shortage, because ultimately they will increase the labor supply or productive capacity of an economy by education and training, and therefore will solve a problem of an economy that is facing a labor shortage. So you can write an answer and say how supply side policies probably are the more appropriate policies, with the only downside, of course, they may not be quick in the short run. Okay, moving on, we could go to November 13, variant 1. I added this question because it talked about how government policies are used when there's a current account deficit. So they said discuss the policies available to a government faced with the current account deficit and consider which policy has the fewest disadvantages for the consumers in that economy. So let's discuss the policies to fix the current account deficit. Broadly, there are two policies that fix the current account deficits. We say they are expenditure switching policy and expenditure dampening policy. Expenditure switching policies may entail further two things. One is what we call import controls, which means quotas, tariffs, and other import controls, even like subsidies given to the exporters. Or it may contain what we call devaluation, which is lowering the value of the currency, lowering the exchange rate in order to make exports cheaper and therefore imports expensive, and that in turn will cause basically your net exports to go up, given some conditions are true. So both of these policies of import control and devaluation are trying to switch away expenditure away from foreign goods towards domestic goods for the domestic consumers, and at the same time they hope to make exports to be more sort of desirable, so that the exports may go up. On the other hand, your expenditure dampening policy may contain what we call contractionary, fiscal, and monetary policy, which have been discussed in detail. But I want to talk about how contractionary, fiscal, and monetary policy is used in the context of import control. So let's talk about that. Basically, what happens is that if the government decides to use expenditure dampening policy, let's say we use fiscal policy, we're trying to basically either reduce government expenditure, or we're trying to increase taxation so that, for example, AD may fall. A fall in AD will cause GDP to fall. As we saw earlier, AD goes down, not only price out goes down, but also the GDP of the economy goes down. And if the GDP goes down, basically we are dampening or reducing the ability to buy. This reduction in ability to buy actually results in all expenditure to fall, even on imports. So through contractionary fiscal and through contractionary monetary policy, we basically make the AD fall, therefore GDP fall, therefore ability of people to buy to fall, and therefore all expenditure, even on imports, to fall, making our X minus M to go up. Now going back to the question was saying this, that discuss the policy available to a government faced with the current account deficit. We talk about how expenditure switching and dampening policies are available, and consider which policy has the fewest disadvantages for the consumers in the economy. So now let's look at some evaluation point for all of these policies, and let's look at consumers' perspective while we are looking at or while we are evaluating. So when we look at import controls, the key evaluation here is this, that in order for import controls to work properly, you need to make sure, number one, there is no retaliation in return. If there's a retaliation happening from another country, that could be problematic because then your policy may not work. For example, if Pakistan puts a tariff on another country, and then another country puts a tariff on Pakistan, then ultimately Pakistan won't be able to improve its net exports to that extent. The second important sort of evaluation here, or sort of drawback here, is this, that it would matter when it comes to putting import controls, because you're increasing the price of goods. It would matter to see what elasticity of the good is. If the goods are inelastic, if PED for sort of exports and PED for imports is inelastic, that would mean that it would not be useful for these policies to work, because you're making imports to be expensive, but ultimately people will be buying these goods, and that would cause your import expenditure to not worsen but to improve. So again, elasticity would matter. Number three, from consumers' perspective, what matters is that when you put import controls, you're trying to make sure the domestic goods consumption increase. But what if consumers do not have good substitutes available in domestic markets? So lack of domestic substitutes can make this policy to be not useful. And last and more importantly is this, that this such a policy of import controls, it does not allow free trade to happen. So the law of comparative advantage may not work in this case, which could be a problem when it comes to efficiency and use of resources. Moving on to devaluation. Well, the evaluation here would be basically, in the case of devaluation, what matters basically is, number one is the same thing, that no retaliation. If there's a retaliation that happens in return, then you would not be able to see the devaluation policy work. For example, Pakistan lowers its exchange rate, and another trading partner does the same. Ultimately, net result would be Pakistan won't be able to gain that comparative advantage through lower exchange rate. So number one, no retaliation should take place. Number two, which is also important, is this what we call the Marshall-Lerner condition. The Marshall-Lerner condition is the same as we mentioned earlier, which says this, that the PED of X plus PED of M, elasticity demand for exports and imports, so the sum must be greater than 1. If the sum is greater than 1, then only you would see the devaluation to work. And if the sum is less than 1, then you would not see the devaluation to work in terms of improving X minus M. So as long as the sum of the elasticity demand is more than 1, your devaluation would result in X minus M to improve. So we want this condition to be true. And the third condition, which is more like a situation that happens for many goods, is something called the J-curve effect. The J-curve effect simply says this, that when you look at devaluation, the trend looks like this. So I have time on my x-axis and I have X minus M balance on my y-axis. So what the argument for J-curve says is that initially, if you're trying to devalue, you must be in a current account deficit. But when you devalue, what happens is basically, initially or in the short run, your net exports may actually worsen. So what this says is that short run, X minus M actually falls. So reevaluation may not work in the short run. But in the long run, with time, you would see devaluation show some positive results. And in the long run, X minus M may improve. So what we are trying to say in J-curve effect is that devaluation works not in the short run but in the long run. And the key reason why this happens has to do with elasticity as well. What we say is this, that goods in the short run are inelastic. So both exports and imports are inelastic in the short run, for many reasons. For example, they are inelastic in the short run because consumers find it difficult to switch from one good to another. domestic producers find it difficult to switch to domestic substitutes, or there might be lack of domestic substitutes. So whatever the reason is, that they are inelastic in the short run, which would mean if they are inelastic in the short run, and if, for example, devaluation makes imports to be expensive, this may actually result in things to become expensive. But in the long run, when people find cheaper substitutes and so on, people would be able to switch, and this would actually result in expand them to improve. Moving on to the contractual fiscal and monetary policy or expenditure dampening policy, we've already done evaluation of that, where we said that these policies are recessionary in nature. They can result in AD to fall and therefore unemployment to happen. And we can conclude this answer by saying this, that probably to go forward, the best policy which has the fewest disadvantage could be, in the long run, to be your supply side policies, which could result in ultimately a country to get a competitive advantage and therefore doesn't have a recessionary impact on the economy, and in turn also result in no retaliation.